turns gold in patterns that he don't understand. This time of year, she is harder to touch, but he goes.
I was asked to talk about my latest creative project called Global Wedding. I'm going to talk a little about that, but I'm also going to talk about how we need to get better at framing climate change, and we need to get better in a big, big hurry. So for those of you who are interested, you actually go and see the latest project of mine, the Global Wedding one, at globalwedding.is/here. Global Wedding is here. Okay? But first of all, so this Global Wedding was a sort of a creative visualization of the biggest scientific report ever published, okay? And that's the IPCC climate change report. Just a question. How many of you actually know what the IPCC is? Raise your hands. All right. So that's actually pretty same as in the general population. Actually, a lot of people know what that is, and it's the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Big, heavy UN organizations. There's another question for you. Do you think there's a scientific consensus on climate change? Raise your hands if you think there's scientific consensus on climate change. All right. So what would you say, those of you who didn't raise your hand, meaning no, you don't think there's a scientific consensus on climate change, what would you say if I would say that then you're less likely to believe that climate change is happening, you're less likely to believe that it's man-made, you're less likely to believe that there's any solution to it because there's not a problem anyway, is there? Do you agree with that? So those of you who said no, would you change your answer if I showed you this one? So those of you who didn't raise your hand, would you change your answer if you saw this? Raise your hands. Does this change anything to you? No. Okay. I mean, the thing is, climate change is a scientific fact, okay? This is as good as it's ever going to be because it's science, and scientists are notoriously not sure about anything, right? So you're just going to have to assume that this is a scientific fact because it is, because it's never going to get any better than this. So it's a scientific fact. It's increasingly also lived human experience. Climate change is a lived human experience. Just ask the people flooding time and again in Bangladesh, or actually some of the flood-prone areas in Norway. Do they think climate change is real? Probably. You're going to get an answer that says yes. The same goes for the flooding in the UK 2 years ago. And there's data on that showing that that actually happened. So it's an increasingly lived human experience, also in our part of the world. But it's still not a social fact. Climate change is not a social fact. It's not really part of our social practices in any meaningful way. I mean, to a certain extent, in some subcultures, that might be true, but it's not a mainstream social practice in any meaningful way. If you count something more than recycling into that equation. It's not really a very significant cultural norm, not mainstream anyway. So it doesn't really constrain our behavior in any meaningful way. And actually, part of the problem is, of course, the symbols that we use, the signifiers of climate change. I mean, I'm going to show you this one. I mean, this is getting pretty old, but this is still being used. You know, the polar bear dying in the Arctic, poor polar bear, let's save the environment. I can't relate to this. Do you see yourselves in that? I mean, literally, maybe you are that guy, I don't know, but I don't see myself in this. I can't relate to this sort of signifiers, symbols, imaginary. I don't. And maybe there's a good reason for that, because it is not meaningful for us as human beings and for our human behavior or our experiences. So, my sort of realization the past 2-3 years working with climate change communication, trying to actually make people understand and trying to imagine what this can mean and what this will mean to us in our lifetimes, is that there's a fundamental failure in which in the way that we talk about climate change and in the way we communicate about it. And I think it's basically, there's two things. It's perhaps based on a misunderstanding of what it means to be human, but it's also based on a misunderstanding of what science can do for you. Half of the time we talk about climate change, we talk about the science of climate change or the science behind climate change. But science will never deliver any sort of solutions to us as human beings, as such. Applied science can do that through innovation. But we somehow forget that. And we also use science as some sort of, we think that it will give us an automated action response, that by talking about the science, people would immediately see the necessity of acting and doing something about climate change. That's never going to happen. I don't think so. We've been trying that for 30 years. It hasn't worked. So for all the sort of hot air, pun intended, and all the talk shops and everything around climate change, all the hype, I don't think we still know how to really talk about climate change. And I think we struggle to see ourselves as part of both the problem, but also the solution. And also one one related problem, and I'm probably going to anger a few people in the audience, is that it doesn't really help to conflate environmentalism with climate change. I think the environmentalist response to climate change is unhelpful, because it doesn't help us to talk about the psychological, economical, or social responses to fossil fuel production. Instead, we're talking about killing badgers or dredging up rivers. And it's also way too easy to dismiss climate change as the biggest challenge of our century, probably, when the public face of climate change are environmentalists. So I think we need to get away from that and get different public faces to represent climate change. Do you recognize this lady? Do you know who she is? Anybody? Yes, thank you, Margaret Atwood, precisely. She's the writer. She writes a lot of science fiction. She also writes a lot about climate change in her books. And this is what she has been saying. I don't even call it climate change. I call it the everything change. It's a change of everything. And I think this is a place where we need to get mentally, because climate change changes everything and will change everything in our lifetimes. And it's something that impacts every aspect of how we live and the way we are and the way we behave, or will do so in our lifetimes. So I think, again, framing is key here, because she doesn't want to talk about climate change. She wants to talk about everything change. And I think if we want to become more successful in talking about climate change and thinking about climate change, we need to get away from calling it climate change. And this is my own personal lesson after working with these things for several years. And it's basically just don't call it climate change. Try to find ways of communicating, talking, and thinking that bypasses that, because it's such a loaded term to begin with. It's so loaded. So we need to bypass that and find a way to talk that is more meaningful, that speaks to us as human beings with emotions. And I think this applies to everybody. It's just, I'm a science communicator partly, and I do a lot of other stuff, but I think this applies to everybody, and I think the creative industry has the biggest potential to come up with the really cool, great solutions to talking and thinking about climate change differently, to frame it in a really, really different, fresh way, okay? So last year I spent developing a project in which we tried really hard to avoid talking about climate change. And I did it together with this guy. I think most of you know who he is, or seen him or recognize him. Anyway, so he's Even Westwang from Bengaluru. And instead of talking about climate change, we started talking about global weirding. So instead of global warming, we got global weirding, because things are getting really weird with climate change, From, freak weather to the fact that actually, if you're really into wine, I don't know, wine production is going to get really bad because it's getting too warm. So Siberia, if you want to invest in good wine stocks, now's the time to start a wine farm in Siberia, because in 50 years' time, your kids, they'll be sitting on a new Rothschild farm or whatever, okay? So we started talking about global weirding, thinking, what can we do with this term? So we even made our own definition of global weirding. And it's kind of nerdy, so you're going to have to excuse us, but we're both kind of nerdy. And the really difficult part of global weirding was, of course, that this was a project or a product designed to communicate the science. And remember, I've been bashing science, saying it doesn't deliver anything as such. We need to do something with it. So this was a double whammy, triple challenge for us, because it was designed to communicate the science, the IPCC report, this thick, totally incomprehensible report, while simultaneously trying to avoid that whole thing about science can deliver something to us, the thinking that I think is quite pervasive in our society. And I think we partially succeeded in that. I don't know to what extent global weirding will become a social, how climate change will become a social fact after global weirding. I don't entertain such big hopes, perhaps, but perhaps it's a small contribution along the way. But what we did do is that what we did really, really well, actually, I'm very proud of this, is that we managed to democratize the science, okay? We've actually given people an equal opportunity to understand the science from being something totally, totally incomprehensible, okay? This is gibberish. I'm going to show you something. Just look at this, okay? Try to read that, please. Can you see it? Yeah, exactly, you give up. Yeah, so did I. And I'm, paid to try to read this stuff, It's just crazy. And so this is actually from the easy part. This is from something called Summary for Policymakers. So they made summaries for policymakers. There's thousands and thousands of pages of this report. So there's a summary for policymakers, only 30 pages, the scientists say. Only 30 pages. But the 30 pages are full of things like this. And I only have to say, if this is for the policymakers, I'm sure the scientists are placing a lot of faith in policymakers, That's the only comment. And this is actually, this is one of the most important things in the whole report. Because it actually says how much carbon we have left if we want to keep us to the 2-degree target. I'm not sure if you've heard about the 2-degree target. But this says how much we've used and how much we can still use before we reach that 2-degree target, and we might face runaway climate change. So it's super important, but totally incomprehensible. So we tried to remedy this. And I don't know if we managed to make climate change into social fact, but like I said, I think we did manage to democratize the science behind it. So let's call it a first step. I like to call it a first step. Because no products or projects are never any finished, you know that. And certainly not for me. So I can just show you we made a short promo video. I urge you to go and play with global weirding. So you got the address and see if you actually get anything out of it. The whole point was to make something that people could get something out of. Regardless if you spend 1 minute or 1 hour playing around with it, you could get still something out of it.
The IPCC report may very well be the single most important document in the world at the moment. Even so, most of us will never have the time to dig into it in any meaningful way. The report is 0.5 meter tall and thick with technical prose. So, we wanted to try to tell a story about coming climate changes, our weird new world, using everyday language and staying close to the IPCC report. First, we got hold of climate simulations running all the way to year 2100. It shows what future temperatures will be like given different levels of future emissions. We show daily snapshots so you can see that even if it gets warmer fast, there will still be cold spells. Then, we collected the impacts of climate change and summarized them in single sentences and ballparked them within reasonable timeframes. Lastly, we got hold of economic simulations of different policy and energy mixes and built a tiny machine that lets you filter the scenarios by different parameters so that you can see what kinds of choices our decision makers really should be making. Visit us at Global Weirding is Here to find out how weird it might get.
So if you're wondering about all the jellyfish that you saw, it actually became a sort of a totem for our project because we understood that the only things that are really thriving on climate change are jellyfish. There'll be plenty of jellyfish in the future. Maybe we'll start eating them, you know. We were making these mock-up headline stories to try to go with the reports, what they were saying. Well, you can please drop that. And we're making up these crazy headlines for the future. You know, jellyfish shuts down power plant in Sweden, but it wasn't even a joke. That happened 3 years ago. The same goes, you know, water crisis topples India's government. Well, that's happened in actually not the government as such of India, but a municipality, and so on. So a lot of these things that we think are kind of out there and crazy, they're actually already happening to a large degree. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at that we need to think about framing in a different way. Framing of climate change. And this is my big plea to the creative industry to get on board, but don't make the same mistakes as the scientific community has done for the past 20, 30 years. Don't make the same mistake as the policy community has done. And it's about framing and thinking about creating spaces for thinking and talking about climate change in a different way. And we need to create narratives. We need to create narratives that are meaningful for us and for our human behavior. That also takes into account culture. You know, we've been too occupied with technology and science. We're not talking enough about culture, I don't think so. Or behavior for that matter. But behavior that goes beyond nudging. Have you heard about nudging? So there's this theory about nudging that you can nudge people in the right direction. Dulting, I think it's called in Norwegian. But we need to talk about human behavior that's more than nudging, that's more than a purely economical way of thinking about climate change and the way we live our lives. And I think you have a unique opportunity to do so and come up with some really, really mind-blowing stuff. So my question to you is, how should we take this forward? How would you create mental space to think about climate change differently, to frame it differently, to frame it in a meaningful way, truly meaningful way? And just to say, finally, I'm winding down, on my personal sort of satisfaction level, I would like to see the concept of global weighting being taken forward. We did this with Evan, global weighting is here. That's just the beginning for me. And like I said, we only partially succeeded. I want to see more of it. I'm very open towards suggestions and ideas on how to take global weighting forward. But I'm also very interested to hear about how you think you can create narratives that are different. Thank you.